Good morning. These are the instructions for Distance Learning Module 7, Day 4. It's Thursday, May 21st. So let's just kind of go back to yesterday because I know there's probably a lot of questions. I did have some students reach out to me and asked if I would have a live session, and indeed I will be going over that activity today. So please tune in for a live session. So let's just let's take a look at what it was that you had yesterday. That would be Day 3. This was a reinforcement activity. And I like the POGIL activities. Those are activities that have these questions that kind of build, and then the complexity of the question usually culminates to some kind of more critical thinking. And then the last questions are always like extension questions of the whole concept. Surface area and volume are in of themselves pretty easy for students to understand, but when you put them together and then apply it to the purpose of life and why things divide and are limited by this relationship of surface area to volume, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. And so that's what the purpose of this activity was, to take the lab and then kind of apply it to that science so that you can get an understanding of how living things are adapting in a way like having more numbers of cells as opposed to fewer numbers of cells because of their efficiency in this relationship of surface area and volume. The activity is a POGIL. In this activity, instead of looking at only the size and the effect of the surface area or the effect on the surface area and the effect on the volume and then the relationship between the two, it also looks at how shape can affect the surface area to volume ratio. And the reason that we even address it is because there are cells in your body that cannot be small. Now, I know up until this point, I've made it sort of clear that there's no other choice, that you have to be small because of this relationship of surface area and volume. That is sort of still true, but, you know, life is innovative. And one thing you can do is maybe change the shape of the cell, and that shape may actually have a different surface area to volume ratio compared to other shapes of similar sizes. So, instead of worrying about size, you can sort of accommodate that consequence of getting bigger by changing the shape. So that's where there are questions in this activity that will draw from that concept. You don't know it by looking at it until you get to those questions. First several questions are very straightforward, and then you have to go into making a graph. Now, the graph that the students had to do, I recommend just making it on lined paper. But if you printed this and you made your graph, and again, I'm going to go over this today, the graph would have looked something like this. And this is something I've already used. I was working with a student, so I've highlighted stuff. But this is what the graph would have looked like. And the idea here in this graph was for you to see that as the surface area expands, the rate in the volume, or I should say the rate in the volume, just the volume, the relationship of the volume, is different for each object at that size. And so you now, based on the graph, I can extrapolate from this graph that this particular object is going to have a volume that expands at a rate a lot less than these as the surface area increases. So that ratio is going to be pretty low. And if we go back to the first couple days in our activities about a living thing, what's the problem with these things getting too big? It's not having enough ability to get nutrients into the center of the cell. And so if you can't get nutrients to the center of the cell, then there are parts of the cell that will never have the ability to produce any energy. They'll die. So that's just inefficient. As you continue through the activity, it does exactly what I just said, and it addresses those components that would be going in and out of a cell. And when we talk about substances going in and waste products going out, we're really talking about like the process of respiration, which is where in the mitochondria, the cells, the energy, you know, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So it's taking in that oxygen from your blood, it's taking in the sugar that's in your blood, the glucose, and inside your cells, it's converting all that and extracting energy, and in the process produces a byproduct of carbon dioxide and water and so forth. And as you exercise, you experience this movement when it gets bogged down. So, for example, if the stuff getting out can't get out fast enough, which means you can't get enough energy in or enough food in, right? Then your cells start to tighten up. So if you've ever been in a situation where you were doing like sports athletics and you're working with low weight but high repetitions, you might feel your muscles starting to tighten up. And that's because this process is bogged down. So there's a level of efficiency. I got to get that stuff out, but I also got to get that stuff in. What's the most efficient size for cells? And they are limited by that. As you move through the activity, oh, we got a little bit of a problem there. Let's see, work around that. Perfect. The data table that was on the front, I think it's the same data table. Yep, got the same data table without the actual objects. So we don't need the actual objects. The names are already there. Now you got to complete this data table. And after completing the table, then you start looking at what's the relationship between specifically the change in surface area compared to the change in volume. And again, in my live session, we'll go over the actual numbers, but you'll see that the surface area is increasing at a rate that's a little bit different than the volume. See, there wouldn't be a problem if the surface area increased at the same rate as the volume as a cell got bigger. But because they increase at different rates, that's where the disparity turns up. So these questions here are designed to try to see if you can extract that look really in detail for a trend. So now we're asking students, here's some information. Do you see a trend or a pattern in the information that you're reading? Then it gets into the actual calculation. And in this particular activity, we're trying to give you a reason, which was identifying the trend. Once you identify the trend, they're showing you what that trend would look like with arithmetic. So now they're basically making a mathematical model to explain that trend that you just identified. And then which shape has the smallest, which one has the highest surface area to volume ratio. And then begins the extension type questions. In this question in particular, revisit your response. In multicellular organisms, some cells need to be large because of the functions they perform. Remember, I talked about muscle cells. What shape would be most desirable for those cells? So I've already given you the answer, but now I'm hoping you see how what I address at the beginning of the activity culminates at the end through these step-by-step processes. So that was yesterday. That's a lot of information. We're not even on to today yet. Unit 4, you need a good fundamental basic understanding to know why cells divide. And this is it here. Okay, we need to get, here we go. All right, so now you're on to today. And the activity for today is to just take those fundamental concepts and really hammer home the idea of surface area and volume, but doing it in such a way that it uses the data that you would have seen from the lab exercise. So this is really cool. This is a Edpuzzle that really uses the exact same things you would have seen in the classroom. It's a great job, about 14 questions in here, and it'll really get into the idea of surface area compared to the volume. It'll explain how you address the lab by looking at not how much pink there is, but the percentage of pink compared to the percentage of the entire cell. And that is the hang up in this lab, is that, well, let's just look really quick. And we don't need to go, even though the gentleman's there in the middle, I can just do a quick thing here. If you look at the width of the clear in the first cube compared to the width of the clear in the last cube, one thing you notice is that they're the same length. So if they're the same length, then that means that the rate at which the hydrochloric acid was diffusing into the cube must have been the same. And that makes sense to me because they're made out of the same materials. And they were placed in the hydrochloric acid for the same length of time. And so the material would probably have something to do with the ability of the hydrochloric acid to flow. So that's affecting the distance component of a rate equation. And the time of however long that was, let's just say 4 or 5 minutes, that's the time component. And so if I do that math, I should get the same rate for all three of these, which you do. But what you notice is the pink that is reached here and the pink that is reached here is a lot greater in the larger cube than it is in the smaller cube. And what that means is that is the amount of the cell that did not receive any nutrient. The hydrochloric acid did not reach those points because the hydrochloric acid turns this whole thing clear. And so it hasn't reached this part of the cell, but it has reached all of this. Now, if we look at this, you might say, well, the smaller cell, it only reached a lot less. Yeah, but it had a lot less to reach in the first place. So let's look at something not more how much pink, but let's look at the percentage of pink reached compared to the percentage of the entire object. And when you do that math, you'll notice that the percentage of pink not reached in the big cube is pretty big compared to the percentage of the whole cube itself. But the percentage of pink not reached in the smaller cube is less than the percentage of the whole cube compared to the large one. So that's the key. The smaller you are, the greater percentage of the inside of the cell you can meet the demands for, such as food, nutrients, and also pulling the waste product out. So hopefully in here after this video, you make the connection about the life component. Why is it so important that this surface area and volume ratio functions so effectively for living organisms at these sort of magic numbers and magic sizes? Why is it not that we're just made of fewer but larger cells? So that would wrap up today. Tomorrow I don't have posted yet, so I'll leave another instructional video tomorrow morning. Again, live session today, definitely. So please come in at your regularly scheduled time. Always know that the Google Meet login for our live sessions is listed somewhere in the stream. Here it is. It's a couple down. So update. And that's it right there if you don't have it. And, it's it. If you have questions and you don't participate in the live session, I will post a copy of the live session at a later date, and you always can reach out to me through email. Thank you.